Our final speaker has been racing around London this afternoon on her bicycle, and that journey from east to west will have triggered memories because we have a lot to thank Obi Felten for, because she launched and basically created Google Campus, which has become a mega hub, as we know, here in London for us. She's got kind of the coolest job title in the coolest unit of one of the coolest organisations. I'm pretty sure we didn't hear about this at school, Obi, when we were doing careers advice. But Obi Felten is the head of getting moonshots ready for contact with the real world at X, formerly known as Google X. And by the way, Google defines moonshots, as you probably know, as solving large problems in the world with the use of technology. So who better to lead us into our final speech to think a little bit about the biggest problems in the world worth solving, I suppose, but also what's being done about them. Please welcome Obi Felten.
Okay, so I stand between you and drinks. That's always a fabulous slot. It's a pleasure to be back here. As you can hear from my accent, although I've now lived in Silicon Valley for 4 years, I actually spent almost 20 years living in London, and I still sort of regard London as my real home. So I moved there 4 years ago to work at X, which is the team behind things like self-driving cars and internet from balloons, energy kites, and delivery drones. And we are based in Silicon Valley. So it's kind of fun for me to come back and talk to you about a few of the lessons that I've learned living there. So one of the questions for this session here was, what will our cities look like in 10 years' time? And I wish I had a really smart answer for you, but I don't. I just hope that it's not going to look like Blade Runner. So what I do know, though, is that cities really matter. Today, already about half of the population of the world lives in urban areas, and by 2050, the UN predicts that that's going to go up to 66%. There are 37 megacities in the world, most of them in Asia. In case you're wondering, London is number 28. So if we want to solve for the majority of people, we have to solve for cities. And they're really a microcosm of the world's problems. They're really complex entities, so the problems vary. But if you look at the speeches that mayors across the world make, there's some themes that emerge. So what they talk about is transportation, mobility, congestion, and parking. They talk about pollution, which used to be caused by heating, but now mostly by traffic. They talk about energy, especially renewable energy, or how to get their city on the grid. And economic development. And of course, there's crime and education and housing and healthcare and waste, et cetera, et cetera. So how are we going to solve these problems? At X, we do have a couple of projects that relate to cities, specifically transportation problems with self-driving cars and Wing, our delivery drones. But clearly, X is not going to solve all the city's problems in the world. So we're not even the best place to innovate, I would argue, given that we are in suburbia in Silicon Valley. And I'll talk more about that later. So instead, I just want to share some of our approach and hopefully inspire some of you to tackle some of these problems. So my first lesson from Silicon Valley is innovation requires a shift in perspective. So I want to start convincing you of something that might sound ridiculous, which is that it's often actually easier to make something 10 times better than just 10% better. If I say to you, can we make a car that can drive for 100 kilometers on a liter of petrol? You might be able to get there just by existing method and small incremental changes. But if I say to you, that car needs to drive 1,000 kilometers on a liter of petrol, you can't just do that. You have to start over. And that means you have to open up completely new ways of thinking, and you also are going to be much more inspiring because others are going to want to help you in this impossible task. The first project at X was the self-driving car. And in the 20th century, that sounded like science fiction. The founder of the project was actually motivated by road safety. So Sebastian Thrun was a German roboticist and Stanford professor whose best friend died in a car accident when he was 18. In fact, 1.2 million people still die on the roads each year. And 93% of those accidents are caused by human error. So Sebastian's radical solution was, what if you take the driver out of the car and make the car drive itself? Much more reliable, never falls asleep, never does its makeup or texts. American freeways, I've seen it all. The best is actually if you're in a self-driving car test drive and people like take photos while driving their car. So the exciting thing is that cars used to be purely mechanical machines, and now they're driven by software because we've had all these advances in computer vision, in computer processing power. Yes, there's machine learning in our cars, in case you're wondering. Image processing, mapping, etc. And so that means that this sort of science fiction is now turning into real science. Now, even 4 years ago when I started at X, people kind of laughed at us. That's how short the time is where you get that mind shift. Because now, of course, it's not just us working on self-driving cars anymore. It's, most of the major tech companies may or may not be working. Some are more open than others about their self-driving car projects. But also the car industry. So we're not going to build anything beyond prototypes ourselves. So the first real self-driving car that Google will bring into the world, or that X's new division that's going to spin out as its own company, will bring into the world, is actually built in collaboration with Fiat Chrysler. My second lesson is that innovation is messy. You have to be prepared to pivot and fail. People talked about that a little bit already. And anyone who pretends that this is otherwise probably isn't really innovating. Because if we knew the answers to the hardest problems, then they would be solved, right? So the only way, really, is to launch early and iterate. Now, I come from software originally, where that's pretty easy. You can do that, and you can always update the software, especially if it lives in the cloud. But with hardware, that's a little harder, as we learned. So about 4 years ago, the self-driving car actually had their first version, their V1, ready. And it was a retrofitted Lexus, and it could only drive on the highway. But they felt pretty confident that this would be a pretty amazing product that would help you take the boredom out of commuting. So they got the first 10 people outside the team, Googlers from other teams, to test the car and use it in their daily commute. And people had to drive to the highway manually, and then they could switch into self-driving mode. What we learned were two things. So the first thing was people complained that this was kind of lame, because they said, why can't the car drive on all roads? Why do I have to drive manually to the highway? That's, rubbish. But more significantly, we learned that there was a fallacy and a basic fundamental assumption, which was that the engineers had assumed that the car would be able to hand off to the human driver if there was an incident that it couldn't deal with. But what we learned was that people completely stopped paying any attention as soon as the car was in self-driving mode. There was a guy who was rummaging around in the back seat to look for a mobile phone charger, and then plugged his phone in, and then started checking his emails. So the idea that that person would be able to react, to have to brake if something happens, was clearly a fallacy. Now, the reason why that's important is because many of what you hear about self-driving cars are actually just evolutions of driver assist technology. So it's making it easier and easier for the driver. And there's a significant difference between that and true autonomy, where the car really just drives itself at the press of a button. So the self-driving car team had massive debates. Do we keep going on this sort of making it more and more assistive to the driver, or do we start over and actually go for true autonomy? And they decided to go for true autonomy, which probably set the project back by about 2 or 3 years. So it was a massive, massive pivot. Now, that's not something they could have planned for, and they only found that when they got into contact with the real world, right? That's why my job title sounds like a joke, but it's actually, very real. Now, this messiness in the process sometimes seems very countercultural to Europeans, because Europeans like to plan ahead more, and like to have a real plan and not just try these things out that are half broken. And we actually find that's what happens when city leaders come to see us in Mountain View. So the European ones have lots of questions about, how to plan for the cities of the futures, how to ensure that the physical environment of the roads and the traffic lights and the cars, interplay, how can we make them all smart, etc. How can we accommodate public and private transport in the future? The American counterparts come and say, how can we get you to test your cars in our city? And we say, but they're not done yet. And they say, we don't really care. We think it's kind of cool. So that's a kind of, interesting divergence, I guess, in attitudes. Let me give you another example of painful lessons from contact with the real world. And that's our other sort of city-based project, which is Project Wing. They're working on delivery by drone. Now, we can get digital goods instantly, but if you think about it, physical delivery is kind of stuck in the dark ages. Like, why does a 2-ton truck show up with a small parcel of your e-commerce order? Why can't we just get into a car that flies across, right? That will be a while, So when we started working on this project, that was an example of one that didn't start with a problem, it started with the technology. So this was, Larry and Sergey made a bet. They said, drones are going to be important, we should have a drones project. So we then brainstormed in the team, what would be our first application? And we got really excited about the use case of delivering defibrillators to heart attack victims. So imagine, someone next to you kills over from a heart attack, you call the emergency services, and within 90 seconds, a drone delivers you a defibrillator, and you save that person's life. That sounded great. Drones were killing machines. We could make them life-saving machines. So then our user experience research team said, okay, let's try and see how this works. So they could put some dummies into the lab, and they gave an innocent bystander a defibrillator, and they said, save this person's life. And then they timed how long it took, and it turned out it took about 6 minutes for the person to figure out the defibrillator, and only half of them actually used it appropriately and would have saved the person's life. Now, ambulances arrive on average in cities between 6 and 8 minutes. So you do the math. We were not solving this problem. And in fact, one of the people in the team said, you guys are idiots. Why don't we just prevent the heart attack? Say we give them like a little thing that they can wear on their wrist and we can tell if they're about to have a heart attack. And that guy was Andy Conrad, who went on to found Verily, which is the health spin-out that came out of X. I think, as far as I know, they're still working on that, but hopefully they'll do it. So the Wing team had to find a new use case. And after much sort of deliberation, they actually landed on food delivery, which almost sounds like a joke. Taco Copter was an April Fool's joke a few years back. But they convinced me that it's actually a really good first application because it's quite difficult. You have to get it there on time, and it has to be hot and not a mess, etc. So don't think of us as building Taco Copter. It's just the first step in what drones can bring to the space. We had other city-related projects that didn't make it at all. For instance, we had an exploration into indoor food growing. Why do we have trucks that deliver our food into a supermarket that you then take home? What if you could just grow tomatoes in your building? I had this beautiful vision of, what if you took out one of the lift shafts and you grew sort of, tomatoes in the lift shaft, and robots would pick them, and you would just press an app and have some tomatoes delivered to you. Unfortunately, when we did the math, we found that replacing the sun's expensive, and all those LEDs were too expensive. And in the end, we could have probably grown really expensive herbs in Scandinavia, which is a great niche startup, but wasn't going to feed the world. So we killed that project. So I said earlier that X or even other Silicon Valley companies are not going to solve all the city's problems. I think city problems are going to be solved by entrepreneurs in cities. Because cities like London are great laboratories, both for technology and for social innovation. And you have the resources to innovate right here, including diversity of people and ideas. Laura touched on this earlier, but Silicon Valley is actually incredibly homogeneous. The towns all look the same. Oh, I'm going to wrap up. Silicon Valley's towns all look the same, rows upon rows of single-story bungalows, nondescript office parks, people who get into their cars, Tesla, of course, or Toyota Prius, to drive or get delivery from one of the many services. Contrast this with the density of streets in Paris or London, right? European cities like London are truly global melting pots, more than ever before. Refugees pour in. People talk about that as a challenge, but it's also an incredible opportunity. When my son went to nursery school here when he was 3, his best friends were a Scottish-Italian girl, an Indian boy, and a Somali girl in a wheelchair who was a first-generation immigrant. So he was just completely gender, race, and diversity blind. That was just his reality. And I hope Brexit's not going to change that. Silicon Valley doesn't have this diversity. We talked about there are not enough women, there are not enough black people, everyone sort of feels kind of rich. And as a result, while many Silicon Valley founders do think big, there's no taking away from that, some of them also seem to be solving problems that aren't really problems. In fact, every time I see a poster in the Bay Area that advertises like another food delivery service or laundry service, my heart sinks a little bit because it feels like it's a bunch of boys who are inventing things that their mum used to do for them as products. And then I felt even sadder when I was in Berlin and I saw a sticker for like a laundry service that pretty much seemed a copy of that. And I was like, don't copy it. So in a world where technologists are part of global networks such as this, they're living in cities across the world and moving across the world, the startups in Europe in particular should know what the real problems are and be solving those real problems. And that, of course, doesn't end with consumer services. We were in Cambridge yesterday. Universities in Europe are full of amazing science and engineering innovations that can be turned into startups, but are still a huge missed opportunity. So if you know of any that are a great fit for X, please send them my way. And in the meantime, I look forward to what you're going to build next. Thank you.